The screen door of the trailer always slammed with the sound of a gunshot, a sharp, rusted crack that signaled the beginning of the evening's terror in that forgotten corner of West Virginia. Caleb, only 12 years old at the time, lay rigid on the thin mattress of his narrow room, listening to the heavy, uneven footsteps trudging up the wooden steps, each thud vibrating through the rotting floorboards like a warning tremor before an earthquake. The air inside the trailer was thick and stagnant, smelling permanently of stale cigarette smoke, damp drywall, and the sharp chemical sting of cheap bourbon that seemed to sweat out of the very walls. Outside, the crickets of the humid American South chirped in an indifferent rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaotic, suffocating atmosphere that was building inside the cramped living space where safety was a foreign concept. Caleb counted the seconds between the slam of the door and the inevitable sound of a bottle cap being twisted off, a ritual that dictated whether he would sleep or bleed that night. His father, Elias, was a man carved from bitterness and lost opportunities. A former coal miner whose lungs were as black as his temper, laid off when the industry collapsed and left the town to rot. He sat in his recliner, the upholstery torn and stained with grease, staring at the static of a television that could rarely hold a signal, muttering curses at invisible enemies, the government, the boss who fired him, the wife who had died and left him with a burden he never wanted. Caleb knew the routine by heart. He knew that silence was his only shield, but even silence could be interpreted as insolence in the twisted logic of a drunk man looking for a punching bag. The boy stared at the ceiling, tracing the water stains that looked like maps of countries he would never visit, trying to disassociate his mind from the knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He was small for his age, malnourished from nights where dinner was forgotten in favor of a 12-pack, his skin mapped with bruises in various stages of healing, yellow, purple, and terrifyingly black. The explosion of violence didn't start with a shout, but with a crash. A glass shattered against the wall, sending shards skittering across the linoleum like diamonds in the dim light. Elias roared Caleb's name, a sound that seemed to tear through the thin, hollow corridor of the bedroom, demanding presence, demanding submission. Caleb moved slowly, his limbs feeling heavy as lead, knowing that delay would only increase the severity of the punishment, yet every instinct in his body screamed to hide under the bed, to vanish into the dust bunnies and forgotten toys. He opened the door to the living room, stepping into the arena, where the air was heavy with the smell of ethanol and unwashed rage. His father stood swaying in the center of the room, a hulking silhouette against the flickering blue light of the TV, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused, searching for the source of his misery and landing squarely on his son. "You think you're better than me?" Elias slurred, the words tumbling out wet and heavy, accusing the boy of thoughts he hadn't yet learned to articulate. He lunged forward, not with the precision of a predator, but with the reckless momentum of a falling tree, his heavy hand connecting with the side of Caleb's head in a deafening slap that sent the boy spinning into the kitchenette counter. The pain was immediate and white-hot, a ringing in his ears that drowned out the hum of the refrigerator, but Caleb didn't cry out. He had learned long ago that tears were like blood in the water for a shark, provoking only more aggression. He scrambled to his feet, tasting the metallic tang of blood from a cut on the inside of his cheek, his eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to make eye contact, refusing to challenge the beast. Elias grabbed him by the collar of his worn-out t-shirt, the fabric stretching and tearing under the strain, and hauled him close, his breath hot and rancid against Caleb's face. "You're nothing," the man spat, shaking the boy until Caleb's teeth rattled. "Just another mouth to feed, just another weight dragging me down to hell." The words hurt more than the blows, etching themselves into Caleb's psyche, confirming his deepest fear that his existence was indeed a mistake, a burden on a world that didn't want him. He was thrown back onto the couch, the springs groaning under the impact, and for the next hour time dissolved into a blur of shouting, broken objects, and sharp stinging pain as Elias vented a lifetime of failure onto the only person who couldn't fight back. When the violence finally subsided, it wasn't because of mercy but because of exhaustion. Elias collapsed back into his chair, passing out mid-sentence, his snores filling the room like the growls of a sleeping dragon. Caleb lay curled in a ball on the floor, his ribs aching with every shallow breath, his left eye already swelling shut, creating a distorted view of the nightmare he called home. He waited until he was sure the sleep was deep, the alcohol acting as a heavy anesthetic on his father's brain. Slowly, Agonizingly, he pushed himself up, his small body screaming in protest, and looked around the wreckage of the living room, the shattered lamp, the overturned table, the empty bottles that stood like sentinels of his misery. He went to his room, not to sleep, but to make the decision that had been germinating in his mind for months, a seed of rebellion watered by pain. He grabbed his school backpack, dumping out the textbooks that spoke of a future he couldn't see, and filled it with the bare essentials: 2 pairs of socks, a flashlight with dying batteries, a stolen loaf of bread, and a photo of his mother he had hidden under his mattress. He moved like a ghost, his bare feet silent on the linoleum, terrified that a floorboard might creak and wake the monster, ending his escape before it began. He paused at the front door, looking back at the slumped figure of his father, feeling a strange mix of hatred and pity, realizing that the man was a prisoner of his own demons, but refusing to be a casualty of that war any longer. Stepping out into the cool night air was like stepping onto another planet. The humidity had broken, leaving a crisp breeze that rustled the overgrown weeds in the yard. The sky was vast and indifferent, filled with stars that looked cold and distant, offering no guidance but simply witnessing his departure. He didn't run immediately. He walked down the gravel driveway, the stones crunching softly under his sneakers, passing the rusted shell of the pickup truck that hadn't moved in years, a symbol of the stagnation he was leaving behind. Once he reached the paved road, he began to run, the rhythm of his feet hitting the asphalt becoming a mantra of survival, pushing him further away from the trailer park, further away from the pain. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like jelly, passing the darkened windows of the town's main street, the closed gas station, the boarded-up cinema, all the ghosts of a dying American town. He didn't have a destination, only a direction, a way, and that was enough to keep him moving through the darkness. He found shelter under a concrete overpass of the interstate, huddling in the shadows as massive trucks roared overhead, carrying goods to places he had only seen on maps. The cold seeped into his bones, and the fear of the unknown began to creep in, whispering doubts into his ear, telling him he wouldn't survive on his own. But then he touched the bruise on his cheek, feeling the heat and the swelling, and the memory of his father's voice saying, "You're nothing," replayed in his mind. That voice, instead of breaking him, ignited a spark of defiance, a cold, hard resolve that settled in his chest, replacing the fear. He realized in that lonely, dark space under the bridge that he had already survived the worst. The world could be cruel, cold, and indifferent, but it couldn't be worse than the hell he had just walked out of. He tightened his grip on his backpack, watching the headlights of passing cars slice through the night, realizing that for the first time in his life, he was free. Morning came with a grey industrial light filtering through the fog, revealing the grit and grime of his surroundings. But to Caleb, it looked like opportunity. He washed his face in a stagnant puddle, ate a piece of the dry bread, and started walking along the highway shoulder, his thumb out, hoping for a ride, hoping for a chance. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he was never going back, and as the sun began to rise over the distant hills, he made a silent vow to himself. He would not just survive, he would build himself into something strong, something unbreakable, something his father could never touch again. The first car that stopped was an old sedan, driven by a weary-looking woman who didn't ask questions, just offered him a bottle of water, and a silence that felt respectful rather than oppressive. As the car accelerated, leaving the town limits behind, Caleb watched the sign "Welcome to Boone County" disappear in the rearview mirror, feeling a heavy chain snap in his soul. He was 12 years old, battered, homeless, and alone in America, but as he looked at his reflection in the side mirror, he didn't see a victim anymore. He saw a survivor, and that was the first step on a long, hard road to redemption. The years that followed were a blur of gritty survival, a montage of cheap motels, under-the-table jobs, and the harsh lessons of the American streets. Caleb aged rapidly, his boyish features hardening into a stoic mask as he navigated a world that had no patience for weakness or hesitation. He worked construction in Oklahoma, washed dishes in a diner in New Mexico, and hauled crates at a dock in Louisiana, his body growing lean and wiry, fueled by the necessity of constant motion. He slept in shelters where the air smelled of unwashed bodies and despair, or in the back of whatever vehicle he could afford at the time, always keeping one eye open, always ready to move. The trauma of his childhood didn't disappear. It morphed into a hypervigilance, a radar for danger that kept him safe but isolated, unable to connect with the people he met, viewing everyone as a potential threat or a temporary acquaintance. By the time he turned 18, Caleb found himself in a dusty town in Texas, staring at a recruitment poster taped to the window of a strip mall office. The soldier in the image looked calm, powerful, and disciplined, everything Caleb wasn't, yet everything he desperately craved to be. He walked into the office, the air conditioning hitting his sweat-stained shirt like a physical blow, and sat across from a sergeant who looked him up and down, seeing not a drifter, but raw material waiting to be shaped. The enlistment process was a flurry of paperwork and medical exams, a systematic stripping away of his past identity, replacing his name with a number, his rags with a uniform. When he signed the dotted line, he felt a strange sense of relief, as if he were signing over the chaotic rights of his life to a higher power, an institution that promised order in exchange for obedience. Basic training was a shock to his system, a calculated assault on the ego designed to break individuals down and rebuild them as a unit. For many recruits, the screaming drill instructors were a nightmare, a source of terror that made them crumble. For Caleb, the shouting was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. He was used to being yelled at, used to physical pain, used to pushing his body beyond its limits. The difference was that here the pain had a purpose, the shouting had a direction. When a drill sergeant got in his face, spitting insults about his heritage or his intelligence, Caleb didn't flinch or look away. He stared straight ahead, his eyes empty of fear, absorbing the aggression like a stone absorbs heat. This resilience, born from years of abuse, caught the attention of his superiors, marking him not as a troublemaker, but as a soldier with a dangerously high threshold for suffering. He excelled in the physical aspects of training, his body already toughened by labor and neglect, responding eagerly to the rigorous demands of the army. While others collapsed on the obstacle course or vomited during the rucksack marches, Caleb found a strange peace in the exertion, the burning in his muscles silencing the memories that still haunted his nights. He learned to shoot, to clean a rifle until it was an extension of his arm, to march in perfect sync with 100 other men, losing his individuality in the rhythmic cadence of boots on pavement. The discipline of the military gave him the structure he had never had, a framework of rules and consequences that was fair, brutal and absolute, a stark contrast to the arbitrary violence of his father. He began to eat 3 meals a day, his frame filling out with muscle, his posture straightening, the slump of the beaten child replaced by the upright carriage of a warrior. However, the internal conflict raged on. The discipline of the army couldn't entirely silence the voice in his head that told him he was worthless, that he was just pretending. At night in the barracks, surrounded by the sounds of sleeping men, Caleb would stare at the bunk above him, fighting the urge to run, to sabotage his success before it was taken away from him. He kept to himself, avoiding the camaraderie and the jokes, afraid that if he let anyone close they would see the cracks in his armor, the terrified boy hiding behind the uniform. His reticence was mistaken for arrogance or extreme focus, earning him the nickname the Monk among his platoon, a label he accepted without comment. He was building a fortress around his heart, brick by brick, using the army's regulations as the mortar, determined to never be vulnerable again. A pivotal moment came during a live-fire exercise, crawling through the mud under barbed wire while machine gun rounds cracked overhead, tearing through the air inches above his helmet. The recruit next to him froze, paralyzed by the overwhelming sensory overload, his face pressed into the dirt, sobbing. In that chaos, Caleb saw a reflection of his own past helplessness, a mirror of the boy cowering in the trailer. Without thinking, he grabbed the recruit by the vest, dragging him forward, shouting commands over the roar of the guns, his voice cutting through the panic. He didn't do it out of kindness, but out of a refusal to let fear win, dragging the other man through the mud until they reached the safety of the berm. That night, the recruit thanked him, but Caleb just nodded and turned away, unable to accept gratitude for something he saw as simple necessity. Graduation from basic training was a surreal experience. Families filled the bleachers, cheering and waving flags, parents hugging their sons with pride and relief. Caleb stood alone in formation, his chest adorned with the marksmanship badge, scanning the crowd not for a familiar face, but to confirm his solitude. He felt a pang of envy, sharp and bitter, watching the reunions, realizing that no one was coming for him, that his victory was his alone. But as the anthem played and the flag was raised, he felt a swelling in his chest that wasn't pride but power, the power of self-reliance, the knowledge that he had pulled himself out of the abyss without a helping hand. He was a soldier now, a weapon of the state, and for the first time in his life he belonged to something, even if that something was a machine built for war. He was assigned to an infantry unit, deploying almost immediately to a combat zone, trading the simulated stress of training for the lethal reality of war. The transition was seamless for him. The dusty, hostile environment of the Middle East felt strangely appropriate, a landscape as harsh and unforgiving as his internal world. He patrolled the streets of foreign cities, his eyes scanning rooftops and alleyways, his finger always near the trigger, finding clarity in the adrenaline. The other soldiers talked about home, about girlfriends and cars and mom's cooking. Caleb listened but never spoke, his silence becoming a heavy presence in the Humvee. He was becoming the perfect soldier, efficient, lethal, and detached. A man who had already lost everything that mattered, and therefore had nothing to fear losing. Yet, the memories of his father persisted, ambush predators waiting for a quiet moment to strike. He would see an old man on the side of the road and flinch, or the smell of burning trash would trigger a flashback to the backyard of the trailer. He realized that running away physically hadn't severed the emotional tether. His father was still in his head, a ghost haunting the corridors of his mind. The violence of war began to blur with the violence of his childhood, the explosions and the shouting merging into a singular, continuous trauma. He knew he was changing, hardening into something cold and brittle, like iron that had been struck too many times. One evening, after a particularly grueling patrol, his squad leader, a seasoned sergeant first class named Miller, sat down beside him on a sandbag wall. "You're a good soldier, Caleb," Miller said, lighting a cigarette, the ember glowing in the twilight. "But you're carrying a ruck that's not army issue. Whatever you're running from, it's going to catch you if you don't turn around and face it." Caleb didn't respond, staring out at the desert horizon, but the words struck deep. He realized that the discipline, the uniform, the strength, it was all armor. But armor didn't heal wounds. It only hid them. The conflict wasn't just on the battlefield. It was the war between the man he had become and the boy he used to be. He was gaining respect, rank, and medals, but he felt hollow, a shell constructed to withstand impact but devoid of a core. He started to understand that true strength wasn't just about endurance or violence. It was about confronting the source of the pain. The idea of returning home began to form in his mind, not as a desire but as a tactical necessity, a mission that had to be completed to secure his own future. As his deployment drew to a close, Caleb made a decision that terrified him more than any firefight. He requested leave to return to the States, specifically to West Virginia. He needed to see the monster again, to measure himself against the nightmare, to see if the uniform and the years had truly made him different, or if he was still just a scared little boy playing dress-up. The journey back would be the true test of his character, a confrontation with a ghost that was still very much alive. The deployment had been a grinder, a relentless sequence of patrols, skirmishes, and the oppressive heat that baked the resolve out of lesser men, but it was a specific incident in the final month that shattered Caleb's remaining emotional barriers. His platoon was ambushed in a narrow valley, a chaotic eruption of RPGs and machine gun fire that pinned them down behind a crumbling mud wall. In the midst of the deafening roar, the squad's youngest member, a kid named Ramirez, who reminded Caleb painfully of himself, eager, frightened, trying too hard to please, was hit in the leg, screaming in a high-pitched panic that cut through the combat noise. Caleb didn't hesitate. He moved with a fluid, practiced aggression, suppressing the enemy fire with his rifle while dragging Ramirez to cover, applying a tourniquet with hands that were steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. As he tightened the strap, Ramirez grabbed his wrist, his eyes wide with terror, pleading, "Don't let me die, don't leave me." In that moment, looking into the eyes of a terrified boy, Caleb saw the reflection of his own childhood trauma, the plea he had never dared to voice to his own father. But instead of fear, Caleb felt a surge of ferocious protectiveness, a realization that he was now the guardian, the strong one, the person who stood between the weak and the darkness. He looked Ramirez in the eye and said, "I got you, you're going home." He held the position for 20 minutes until the medevac arrived, firing with a precision that was almost mechanical, his mind crystal clear. When the chopper lifted off, carrying the wounded boy to safety, Caleb slumped against the wall covered in dust and dried blood and felt something inside him break, not a breakdown, but a breakthrough. The fear that had dictated his life, the shadow of his father's fists, finally dissolved under the weight of his own agency. He had saved a life, he had commanded chaos, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was no longer a victim. This realization followed him back to the base, a quiet epiphany that changed his posture, his gaze, his entire demeanor. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was leading. The incident earned him a commendation, but the medal meant less to him than the internal shift. He realized that his father's power over him was based on a lie, the lie that Caleb was weak, worthless, and dependent. The war had stripped away that lie, proving it false in the most extreme crucible imaginable. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred, holding a rifle that could end life at 500 yards, and understood that the physical threat of his father was now laughable. The real battle was psychological, and he had just won the decisive engagement by proving his own worth to himself. However, the break also brought a wave of repressed anger, a cold, focused rage that needed a target. He wasn't angry at the enemy insurgents, he was angry at the years lost, the childhood stolen, the man sitting in a recliner in West Virginia who had tried to break him. The distance between the desert and the trailer park felt suddenly non-existent. The unresolved past was a tether snapping him back. He requested his leave paperwork the next day, his commanding officer noting the strange intensity in Caleb's eyes, but approving it without question. Caleb wasn't going back for a family reunion, he was going back for an exorcism. The flight back to the United States was a decompression chamber, transitioning from the hyper-alertness of a combat zone to the banal safety of civilian life. He sat in the terminal in Atlanta, watching families greet returning soldiers, the tears and the balloons, feeling entirely detached from the spectacle. He was a ghost in the machine, a man with a singular purpose that isolated him from the joy around him. He rented a car, a nondescript sedan, and began the drive north, watching the landscape shift from the flat plains to the rolling, tree-covered hills of Appalachia. The beauty of the country felt deceptive, hiding the rot and the poverty he knew existed in the hollows and the valleys. As he crossed the state line into West Virginia, the physical sensation of anxiety tried to return, a tightening in the chest, but he crushed it with deep, rhythmic breathing, the same technique he used before breaching a door. He wasn't the boy who ran away. He was a sergeant in the United States Army, a combat veteran, a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and feared no evil. He turned up the radio, drowning out the silence, driving with a steady hand toward the town that had been his prison. The roads became familiar, the landmarks triggering flashes of memory, the bridge where he hid, the gas station where he bought candy when he had a few coins, but they looked smaller now, insignificant, stripped of their monstrous scale. He arrived in town just as the sun was setting, casting long, melancholy shadows across the deserted main street. The decay was more advanced than he remembered. Storefronts were empty, the paint peeling like dead skin, the faces of the few people walking the sidewalks etched with the hopelessness of the opioid crisis and economic collapse. It was a ghost town in the making, a place forgotten by time and progress. Caleb felt a pang of sorrow, not for the town, but for the wasted potential, the trap that caught so many, including his father. He checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts, laying his dress uniform on the bed, smoothing out the creases with obsessive care. Tomorrow he would go to the trailer. That night, sleep was elusive. He lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the motel, the hum of the ice machine, the muffled arguments in the next room, and rehearsed the encounter in his mind. He didn't know what he would say, or if he would say anything at all. He played out scenarios, his father attacking him, his father ignoring him, his father being dead. The uncertainty was the only variable he couldn't control. He got up and did push-ups until his arms trembled, seeking the burn to ground himself in reality. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, the harsh fluorescent light highlighting the scars on his face, the intensity in his eyes. He saw a stranger, a dangerous stranger, and he wondered if his father would even recognize him. The morning of the confrontation was grey and drizzling, the weather conspiring to set the mood. Caleb showered, shaved with precision, and put on his Class A uniform. He buttoned the jacket, adjusted the tie, and pinned his medals to his chest. each one a testament to a trial endured and overcome. He laced his boots, polishing them one last time until they shone like black mirrors. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see Caleb the victim. He saw a symbol of authority, discipline, and unyielding strength. He put on his beret, adjusting the angle perfectly, and walked out to the car. The drive to the trailer park was a journey through time. The gravel road was more washed out than before, the potholes deeper. The trailer park itself looked like a graveyard of aluminum and rust. He pulled up to his old home, and the sight of it hit him like a physical blow. The trailer was sagging, the siding covered in green algae, the windows grimy and dark. The porch steps were broken, rotting away into the mud. It was a pathetic, dying structure, barely holding itself together. The truck was still there, consumed by weeds, a tombstone of his father's mobility. Caleb turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a moment, listening to the rain tap against the roof of the car. His heart rate remained steady, his hands dry. He stepped out, the mud squelching under his polished boots, and walked up the path he had run down so many years ago. He stepped onto the porch, avoiding the rotted planks, and stood before the door. He didn't knock. He didn't announce his presence. He reached out, turned the handle, it was unlocked, of course, because who would steal from a ruin, and pushed the door open. The smell hit him instantly. The same stale smoke, the same damp mold, but older now, more fermented. The smell of death waiting to happen. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and looked into the gloom of the living room. The interior of the trailer was a mausoleum of Caleb's childhood trauma, preserved in filth and neglect. Piles of old newspapers and magazines created narrow pathways through the living room. Trash bags filled with God knows what were stacked in corners, and the air was thick with the dust of undisturbed years. The furniture was the same, though more threadbare, the stuffing spilling out of the couch like entrails. It was a scene of hoarding and giving up, a physical manifestation of a mind that had collapsed in on itself. Caleb walked slowly, his boots making a distinct, authoritative sound on the floor. Contrasting with the soft shuffling of vermin he could hear in the walls, he felt a wave of revulsion, not just at the filth, but at the realization that he had once normalized this, that this had been his entire world. His father was not in the living room. The recliner was empty, a hollow impression in the seat marking where Elias had spent decades wasting away. A coughing fit erupted from the back bedroom, Caleb's old room or the master, he couldn't tell initially, a wet hacking sound that rattled the thin walls. It was the sound of lungs filled with fluid and tar, the sound of a body failing. Caleb moved toward the hallway, his posture erect, his face an impassive mask. He passed the kitchen, noting the sink piled high with dishes that had likely been there for weeks, the counter sticky with spilled substances. The poverty here wasn't just financial. It was a poverty of spirit, a complete absence of hope or dignity. He reached the door to the master bedroom, which stood slightly ajar. The smell of sickness, unwashed sheets, medicine, and old sweat was overpowering here. Caleb pushed the door open with a gloved hand, stepping into the dim light. The curtains were drawn, letting in only slivers of grey daylight that cut across the room like laser beams. On the bed, buried under a pile of mismatched quilts, lay a figure that Caleb barely recognized. Elias had shrunk. The hulking brute who had dominated Caleb's nightmares was gone, replaced by a skeletal, withered old man with skin like parchment and sparse white hair sticking up in tufts. Elias was awake, staring at the ceiling, his breathing labored and wheezing. He turned his head slowly as Caleb entered, his eyes cloudy with cataracts and confusion. He squinted, trying to make sense of the silhouette standing at the foot of his bed. "Who's that?" he rasped, his voice a shadow of the thunderous roar Caleb remembered. "Nurse? Is that the nurse?" The question hung in the air, pathetic and delusional. He didn't even recognize his own son. He assumed it was state-appointed care, the only contact he likely had with the outside world. Caleb stood silently, letting his eyes adjust, taking in the oxygen tank in the corner, the bottles of pills on the nightstand, the glass of water with a denture soaking in it. "No," Caleb said, his voice deep, resonant, and steady. It was the voice of a man who gave orders, not one who took them. Elias flinched at the sound, a flicker of recognition or perhaps just fear of the unknown sparking in his eyes. He pushed himself up on his elbows, trembling with the effort, peering through the gloom. Caleb stepped forward into a shaft of light, the gold buttons on his uniform catching the gleam, the medals on his chest flashing. He removed his beret, tucking it under his arm, and looked down at his father with a gaze that was neither hateful nor loving, but clinical. "Caleb," Elias whispered, the name sounding foreign on his tongue, as if he hadn't spoken it in years. The recognition brought a sudden tension to the old man's frame. He shrank back against the headboard, instinctively raising a hand as if to ward off a blow. That simple gesture, the abuser flinching from the abused, was the final confirmation Caleb needed. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The monster was just a scared, dying animal. You came back," Elias stammered, his eyes darting over the uniform, the rank, the sheer physical presence of his son. He looked for the fear he used to instill, the submission he used to demand, and found only a wall of granite. "I'm here," Caleb stated, not offering comfort. He looked around the room, seeing a framed photo of his mother on the dresser, cracked glass, covered in dust. He walked over, picked it up, wiped the dust off with his thumb and set it back down. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the unspoken history of violence between them. Elias watched him, his breathing becoming faster, more agitated. I didn't think—" Elias started, then coughed violently, doubling over. Caleb didn't move to help him. He watched the fit pass, waiting for the old man to recover. "Look at me," Caleb commanded softly. Elias looked up, water in his eyes. "I didn't come here to hurt you," Caleb said, answering the unspoken fear. "I didn't come here to yell. I came to let you see." He spread his hands slightly, indicating himself, the uniform, the man he was. "You spent 18 years telling me I was nothing. You tried to beat me into the dirt." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You failed." The statement wasn't a shout. It was a simple fact, delivered with the cold precision of a judicial verdict. Elias slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked at his son, really looked at him, and the realization of what he had lost and what he had created washed over him. He saw the strength he never had, the discipline he couldn't master, the honor he had drank away. Tears began to leak from his eyes, tracking through the grime on his cheeks. "I was sick," Elias mumbled, the eternal excuse of the addict. "The drink. It took me." It was a weak plea for absolution, a deflection of responsibility that Caleb had heard 1,000 times before. "The drink didn't hit me," Caleb corrected him, his voice hardening slightly. "You did." He wouldn't let the old man hide behind the bottle anymore. "But it doesn't matter now, because I'm not that boy anymore, and you—" He looked at the frail figure in the bed. "You are exactly what you chose to be." The truth hung there, brutal and inescapable. Elias looked away, unable to hold his son's gaze, shame finally penetrating the fog of his mind. Caleb walked to the window and pulled the curtains open. The grey light flooded the room, exposing every stain, every dust mote, every failure. Elias covered his eyes, shying away from the exposure. "Why did you come?" he wept, his voice cracking. "Just to shame an old man?" He sounded like a child now, petting and self-pitying. "To say goodbye," Caleb said, "and to make sure that when you die, you know exactly who survived you. It was a harsh mercy. He wasn't there to kill his father, but to kill the memory of his father's power. He was reclaiming the narrative of his life." He turned back to the bed. "I forgive you," Caleb said, and the words were not warm. They were a severance, not for you, for me. "So I don't have to carry you anymore." The words "I forgive you" hung in the stale air like smoke, separating the two men more effectively than any wall. Elias looked up, stunned, his mouth slightly open, struggling to process the concept. He had expected anger, violence, or perhaps pity, but forgiveness, delivered with such cold detachment, was alien to him. It stripped him of his role as the antagonist. He was no longer the monster in the story, just a pathetic footnote in his son's life. He tried to speak, to formulate some response, but his throat worked uselessly, no sound coming out. He was small, so incredibly small, beneath the weight of his son's gaze. Caleb didn't wait for a response. He had said what he came to say. The emotional tether that had bound him to this rotting trailer and this broken man was severed. He felt a physical lightness, a release of tension in his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was carrying for a decade. He put his beret back on, adjusting it by feel, the familiar motion grounding him. He looked at the room one last time, memorizing the squalor not to dwell on it, but to ensure he never forgot where he came from and why he would never return. "Goodbye, Elias," Caleb said. He didn't call him Dad or Father. Those titles were earned, and Elias had forfeited them long ago. He turned on his heel, a sharp military pivot, and walked out of the bedroom. He walked down the hallway, past the kitchen with the dirty dishes, through the living room with the piles of trash, and to the front door. He stepped out onto the porch, the cool, damp air filling his lungs, cleansing the smell of sickness from his nose. The rain had stopped, and a faint break in the clouds was letting a shaft of sunlight touch the distant hills. As he walked down the rotting steps, he heard a sound from the bedroom, a wail, a long, mournful cry of regret and loss. It was the sound of a man who realizes too late that he has thrown away the only thing of value he ever produced. Caleb paused for a fraction of a second, his boot hovering over the mud, but he didn't turn back. He continued walking to the car, his stride long and purposeful. He got in, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel. He didn't look in the rearview mirror as he drove away. The trailer, the father, the town, they were behind him now, permanently. He drove to the local cemetery, a place he hadn't visited since he was a child. He found his mother's grave, a simple stone marker that was overgrown with grass. He spent an hour there clearing the weeds, cleaning the stone with water from a bottle in his car. He spoke to her, not aloud but in his heart, telling her that he was okay, that he had made it, that she didn't have to worry anymore. It was a quiet moment of connection, a honoring of the only softness he had known in his childhood. When he stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees, he felt a sense of completion. The circle was closed. He drove out of town, the road opening up before him. He stopped at a diner near the highway, the same kind of place he used to wash dishes in years ago. He sat at the counter, ordered a black coffee and a slice of pie. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, noticed his uniform. "Heading home, soldier?" she asked, pouring the coffee. Caleb smiled, a genuine rare smile that reached his eyes. "No, ma'am," he replied. "I'm already there." He realized that home wasn't a place on a map. It was the peace he had built inside himself. It was the discipline, the purpose, the future he was creating. He thought about Ramirez, the kid he had saved in the desert. He thought about his squad, his brothers. That was his family now. The army had given him the tools to destroy, but it had also given him the tools to build a man out of the ruins of a boy. He paid for his coffee, leaving a generous tip, and walked out to his car. He had a long drive back to the base, back to his duty, back to his life. As he merged onto the interstate, the sun finally broke through the clouds completely, bathing the highway in golden light. Caleb rolled down the window, letting the wind hit his face. He checked his reflection in the mirror one last time. The bruise-counting boy was gone. The runaway was gone. In their place was a man who had faced his demons and won. He saluted the empty road ahead, a salute not to a flag or an officer, but to himself and to the freedom he had finally, truly earned. The engine roared as he accelerated, driving away from the shadows and into the light. The silence of the past was finally broken by the sound of his own future. He was free.